Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin.
Adam Meakins. Now, this is something I've been looking forward to for a while. So anybody who's not super familiar with you, they're going to have fun. You're a physical therapist and strength coach, and you're this irascible personality online debunking the silly bullshit quote of the physical therapy and the strength world. It's great to have you on.
Thanks very much for the invite, Andrew. Looking forward to having a chat and hopefully crushing a bit of silly bullshit.
Okay, so let's dive into some of my favorite silly bullshit. So, what's wrong with the popular passive physio methods like cupping, dry needling, shockwave, kinesio tape, scraping? Go ahead, just launch.
Where to start? Yeah. So these passive treatments for various different pains and pathologies, they're basically feel-good treatments. They are things that make people feel different afterwards. Um, I think that there's nothing wrong with feeling good, when you've got pain and problems. It's good to have pain relief. It's good to be able to have a respite from something that's causing you some distress and discomfort. But I think where the harm comes from with a lot of this type of treatment isn't so much in the treatment itself, but it's in the narratives and the explanations about what it's doing and how it's doing that, and the need and the necessity to have it. So this is one of my biggest bugbears, is that I think a lot of healthcare, including physiotherapy, osteopathy, chiropractic, I'm not going to, just lay it all on one type of profession, but all of healthcare overtreats a lot of pain totally unnecessarily. And I think it's having an adverse effect on the population, on the species. I think we're seeing a lot of reduction in resilience towards painful problems because we overtreat them and overlook to get pain reduced too quickly, too unnecessarily, rather than reassuring people that pain is okay, it's not dangerous, it's not harmful, it's unpleasant. We're going to be compassionate, we're going to be, calm and caring about explanations around pain. We're not going to be cold and discompassionate and invaluing their personal, experiences. But we just got to start trying to get people to recognize that, pain has a lot of the time, particularly in musculoskeletal conditions, a very favorable natural history, which means it's going to get slowly better over time. People need to understand that that time is going to be longer than they want or anticipate or expect, because that's human natures. We're all impatient. And we just need to be able to be better at just perseverance, resilience, dealing with things rather than just constantly trying to reduce and get rid of it. So I think, healthcare wants to try and promote a bit more of that, I think, rather than this constant reduction of pain, more about reassurance around pain. And then I think the other problem with these passive treatments is it steals time and attention away from things that I think could be far more effective to help people with their painful problems, which is more movement-based type of approaches and lifestyle type of approaches as well. And that's where I think, good quality rehab and therapy really kicks in to its own. And it's trying to get therapists to start to recognize that actually the power of rehab and therapy comes through active interventions rather than these passive interventions of cupping and taping and scraping, because you can modulate somebody's pain, change their perceptions of pain with active interventions, I think, just as effectively as you can with these passive interventions. Giving things a little bit of a wiggle and a waggle can be just as pain alleviating as giving things a bit of a poke and a press and a rub. And I think, getting people moving and being more active, again, helps promote resilience and robustness, which I think we just talked about is a good thing to do. But it's also going to help improve a host of other secondary factors, which these passive treatments doesn't do. You're not going to get your cardiovascular system to be upregulated and improved by having a massage. You're not going to get your metabolic status, improved by having some cupping. You're not going to improve your cross-sectional area of a dysfunctional or weak muscle group by having some mobilizations on it. Whereas you get people moving and exercising, these things could all be improved as well as having pain modulation. So I honestly think, these active interventions, you get two for one, whereas the passive treatments, you just get.
To what degree do you think it's the people asking for the magic pill, the potion, who don't want to do the work the same way that we see with, fat loss? And I had a recent episode on Ozempic, so I'm absolutely not lumping Ozempic into that. I think people can approach Ozempic in that manner, and if they don't dive into strength training, then obviously we know that there's fear of losing muscle mass. But to what degree are and again, it's not to say that it's ethical to serve the demands of people, the grifters who are selling fat loss pills, you know, even if people demand it, it still doesn't make it right. But what degree is it driven by the hope and the expectation of the user for, hey, just want this pain to go away. I don't want to do anything though.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think a lot of it is driven by the patient wanting, demanding, requesting, asking for these interventions, and placing the pressure and the ownership onto the therapist to feel obliged to be able to do these things to them. So it does take a lot to be able to, work with that and be able to try to get somebody who is not perhaps wanting to expend the cognitive and physical energy and effort into the more active approaches and wanting this more passive type of approach to be done because it is less effortful, easier as they perceive it. It is challenging to try and turn that around. And I'm not going to say it's always possible to do. And I don't think it always needs to be done either. I'm not going to be sitting here and saying everybody now needs to just start, the active treatments. Nobody needs or benefits from massage or mobilizations because I don't think that's true at all. I just think we've got to be better at promoting it as a first line treatment, as not saying it's the main treatment, as not saying it's the only thing that we should be doing. These things are called adjuncts for a reason. They should be used as add-ons, as things that can, in some situations, in some circumstances, maybe assist and help people. But yeah, I think a lot of this is driven culturally and societally and just basically genetically as well. Human beings have that natural energy conservation approach as often as they can, whenever they can. So if you don't have to expend energy physically, or we won't. And if we can think that something can help fix us and correct us without having to expend as much energy and effort, then yeah, the natural desire is going to be want to choose that first.
Can you explain regression to the mean in the context of pain and injury and healing?
Yeah, so regression to the mean is actually a statistical term. It's used in statistics to define when in a system we just see over time things going back towards the mean, towards the baseline. When we are talking about it in healthcare, I think sometimes we are using that term interchangeably with natural history, where we see natural history of a lot of musculoskeletal conditions is things build and they hit a crescendo and then they slowly improve over time. And it's that improvement over time, that natural history, that is sometimes referred to as regression to the mean, which is what we see in systems statistically. Whereas if you have outliers, you have these points of data that are pluses or negatives, then you start to see over time they get less variable and they start to refer back to or regress to the mean.
And does sometimes the passive treatment, people go in, they get the chiropractic adjustment, they feel better. Can that sometimes mask just the fact that it would have felt better anyway within a week or two?
Absolutely. So I think a lot of treatments get a lot of unfair recognition and credit for natural history, just doing the majority of the work in the background. Coincidental timing is a major confounding factor to a lot of treatments and interventions in musculoskeletal health. So I think what happens a lot of the time when somebody has an episode of back pain, they feel it. A lot of people won't rush straight away to go and get some assistance or diagnosis or treatment. I think it depends on the severity, of course, but a lot of people who just get this back that starts grumbling and aching, they'll leave it for a while and it does build. And often, we start to see this crescendo in symptoms. It hits a peak and people go, bugger this, right now it's time to go and see somebody. So they go and see somebody, they get an assessment. This person goes through the processes of starting to treatment. But because we know they've hit that crescendo, that's when they've seen or sought some intervention. They are starting now, as the time is progressing, to naturally feel better anyway. But because they're undergoing treatment, They assume it's the treatment that's making them feel better, rather than if they were just to sit it out for a bit longer, they would have started to feel better without that treatment.
What do you say when people make claims of, oh, I'm going to see the chiropractor because my their back is out, hip, some other joint is out, and the chiropractor has like put a bone back in place? Is that real?
Yeah. No, it's not real. So the subluxation theory of things slipping out of place has been well and truly refuted, and it's been refuted for decades, if not centuries now. But it is a strong nocebic narrative that is still out there in musculoskeletal healthcare, with a lot of people, as I say, getting told that things are out of alignment, out of place, and they need to get them put back into place. And I just think it's a really shitty way to explain things to people, because it gives people this impression that their body is fragile, that their body is easily changeable, that it can be just slipped out of place by getting out of bed the wrong way in the morning, or doing something incorrect, or a bad technique in an exercise, and that can cause something to pop out. And it's just absolute bullshit. And I think this belief that it instills into people that their body is that easily changeable and damaged and broken is it's a shitty way to go through life feeling like that. Our bodies are amazingly robust and resilient, and I think that's what we want to be trying to promote to people, not the opposite, which is what all these narratives do.
We can go back to a lot of the, because I want to dive into some of the first things I mentioned, cupping, scraping, et cetera. And it's like the idea of scraping, that someone can take a metal thing and scrape it across your skin, and somehow that is creating some modulation to the tissue. If we were that fragile, any type of interaction we would have in any context would cause us to shatter, right? So we're far stronger than that. I mean, you need to, I think the narrative is like, in order to actually adjust fascia, you probably need to roll over yourself with like a car, and then the musculoskeletal damage would be so severe anyway, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah.
let's yeah, like fire away at that.
Yeah, the fascia is the new sexy thing at the moment. Well, it's not at the moment; it's been going on for years as well. But everybody talks about releasing the fascia, and you say scraping it or doing these specific techniques are believed to do that. And again, it's complete and utter bullshit. There's been numerous studies that have actually, looked at the amount of force needed to deform fascia. And we got to recognize fascia comes in various different thicknesses and densities. It's not uniform throughout our body, but there's parts of the fascia that are incredibly dense and incredibly thick, as you said, that would take astronomical forces to be able to structurally alter. So there's no way that a therapist who's rubbing something up and down you is going to make any significant difference to that. I think, we're talking in the realms of thousands of newtons of force per centimeter square needed. I think the densest fascia I've seen is the iliotibial band that's been looked at, and it's been nearly, I think, 9,500 newtons per centimeter squared needed to deform it by 1%.
What would
So
be
we are
a
talking huge
what would be
forces.
a real life? Because even I'm kind of like, and I'm not bad with like post-secondary like physics
Yeah.
and chemistry, what have you, but what would be a real life example of the kind of pressure needed?
So for that, if we do a rough conversion into kilograms, we're talking about 950 kilograms of force to be put per square centimeter onto the fascia for it to be on the iliotibial band fascia for it to be deformed by
What
1%. So
could produce that
950,
level? What would it
nothing,
take to?
nothing, yeah, nothing in that a human being could do. A mechanical machine, absolutely. A steamroller, maybe, but nothing that a human would be able to achieve.
Okay,
But
so
the other fascia, which is a bit softer, that has, less forces required, but we are still talking out of the realms of what a human being can achieve.
all right, so and I started out with mentioning things like cupping, shockwave, et cetera. And anyone who goes to your social media could see you have evidence-based sort of takedowns of these things. And but you also provide important context. And I've been a big believer. I've got a bunch of physical therapists I work with. Number one, my rule for physical therapists is they have to actually have a strong understanding of and valuation of resistance training, because I believe that's the key to all rehab. You said as much earlier. But you alluded to the fact that I believe there can be a place for passive modalities, especially if it relaxes the neural tone of a tense site that maybe then allows you to immediately move load into, as appropriate, into that range of motion. So what has some validity and what is really bullshit? My attitude towards cupping, I see people with these octopus marks on them. And I'm like, there's no scientific mechanism by which that actually makes sense, the claim. So that one to me, I just throw it out completely. What has validity in the context that it will passively help people feel better? And what do you think is just such charlatanery that no one should ever pay their money for it?
Yeah. I think just simple massage. I think massage is something that is overcomplicated. Everybody tries to rebrand it. They try to give it their own unique little
Lymphatic
unique selling.
drainage,
Yeah, they'll
fascial.
add something Swedish sports massage. They'll use all these or sports massage. They'll use all these variations of different terms to basically explain doing some soft tissue work, massage. Somebody placing their hands onto your soft tissues, gently kneading them, moving them various different directions at various different intensities. These type of treatments, I think, are the ones that, do have some ability to give you that little bit of relaxation, neuromodulation, and can make you, say, feel nice and loosey-goosey afterwards, a little bit
Oxyto
relaxed or
Oxytocin, human compassionate touch, right? That's real.
yeah, and I think that's another massive factor, just having that 30, 45 minutes of lying down in a relaxed environment, with the fluffy towels, you've got maybe a bit of whale music going on in the background, maybe a nice little joss stick has been lit, you've got a nice little lava lamp flickering away in the corner. You're sitting there, you're chilling out, and you're getting this nice caring, comforting, relaxing touch from another human being who's spending some time and attention on you. Those contextual effects, I think, can be glorious for people to relax them, de-stress them, and give them this perception of their body now feeling different than it was before it started. Yeah.
And I suppose on a regular basis, if you were systematically incorporating something that upregulates parasympathetic recovery nervous system, tone, state of being, that's probably a really good thing, especially if people are chronically stressed.
I think, those individuals that have got, these demanding, high stress workloads, lifestyles, and they've got the time, they've got the energy, or they've got the financial disposable income to be able to, go and spend some time getting these treatments. I think those are the people that benefit from the most. The ones that don't are the ones that normally are going to feel more stressed after they've had it done because they just think, fuck, I've spent $100 on that. I haven't really got $100. I'm going to have to sacrifice something else now. Or they're, thinking about, other things that are going on in their life because of other time factors and constraints they've got. And they're thinking guilty because they shouldn't be sitting here trying to relax. These individuals are probably not going to get the same effects from these interventions, unfortunately. And so I think, it's normally for people that, as I say, that have all their other ducks lined up in good order. These are the ones that I think are the best benefiters or beneficiaries of passive treatments, massage, soft tissue work. Others that have still got, things that they really need to be spending time on, that hour would be better spent rather than going to get a massage is perhaps looking to try and address something else in activity levels, lifestyle factors, cognitive issues, or something along those lines.
More sleep,
Or more sleep.
the
I saw
basic
a
one.
funny meme a couple of days ago, actually, that made me laugh about recovery. About I'm so stressed about my recovery strategies because I've got to go and get my ice bath at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I've got to do this and got to do this, and it's actually making me feel more stressed, not less recovered. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point you raised, that it's like almost like people who already have the advantage of their circumstance are probably the ones who will benefit from it. And then the ice bath's a great illustration of that. I mean, if someone, for whatever lunatic reason, decides this is how I want to spend my leisure time and this somehow juices me up, hop in a cold plunge. I mean, great. I've done it. And I'm going to say something. Sorry, I would say it. The only two times I've ever gotten into a cold plunge is because a beautiful woman had basically been there with me to lure me in there. Okay, so that was my motivation. All right, I admit it. Sorry, uh, but outside of that, that's not my morning ritual. I mean, shit. Right now, all I need to do is go outside and I get the effects. I'm in northern Canada in the wintertime, right? And it's particularly cold. Now, what about cupping? Because cupping is one of those weird ones that seems to both be oddly popular and yet almost like the worst in terms of its evidence-based validity.
Yeah, so again, it's gotten popular again because of the professional athlete effect. So it really kicked off, I think, after the Olympics when Michael Phelps was seen with these weird circular bruises on his shoulders. I think it was the 2012 Olympics in London, maybe, where it all
And it
sort of
was
really kicked
same
off.
shit with the kinesio tape. We could throw the
Yeah,
kinesio
that
tape
was,
right in the same
I think,
bucket.
the Olympics before. Yeah, they sort of started seeing these athletes with tape strapped around them. But yeah, cupping, as I say, has been now, getting more and more popular because of professional athletes going to get it done. And again, lots of stupid claims about what it's doing, sucking out toxins, is the most common one I see. And that's what you're doing because sometimes you get this sort of capillary leakage. You get this blood collecting underneath the cups that they drain off, and they say, "Oh, this is all the stagnated toxins." And I'm like, "No, it's not." All cupping does is it does sometimes if you put the pressure on hard enough, which is why you get the bruises, it can actually cause the capillaries to break and rupture. So you're creating actually more trauma to the body, not less trauma. You're actually causing more structural damage to the small capillaries in the skin. I mean, it is small damage. It's not going to cause major problems, but it is going to create, more repair processes need. It's now going to create this, small inflammatory response afterwards to the skin. But all you're doing there, as I say, is just creating bruises on people. It's just stagnated blood that's been drawn out of the capillaries that's now stuck underneath the epidermis of the skin, which is what the circles that you see there. And it's no different than a bloody love bite. It's no different than a hickey that you'd get at school. And I mean, as much as love bites for me did have some therapeutic benefits back in the day, I'm not going to say that they're going to have anything majorly beneficial for most people with their pains and problems.
It almost sounds like bloodletting or use of leeches, the same sort of philosophy that goes back like long debunked pseudoscience from ancient medical ideology.
Yeah,
What
and I
about
think there is that element of appeal to, antiquity and Eastern philosophy that all sometimes helps sell these things as well, because people like to sometimes look into, the alternative medicines and the Eastern medicine rather than big pharma and Western medicine. And there's this appeal to antiquity. If it's been around for hundreds of thousands of years, then obviously it must be effective. It must be doing good. And that's, the same with acupuncture. I keep hearing people using that commonly as a reason why it's good treatment because it's been around for thousands of years. A common misconception though, because it hasn't actually acupuncture.
okay, so I was going to ask about dry needling, which is sort of, I guess, a cousin of quote acupuncture. Actually, what's the difference, and are there any therapeutic benefits, any major issues you have with it? You're smirking.
Yeah, so dry needling is an offshoot of acupuncture. I mean, they're both, stimuluses. They are both sharp little pointy things that you put again into people's soft tissues. And again, it will create this perception of something different afterwards because all stimuluses do. They change how we feel afterwards. But the belief that acupuncture is has to be done at certain points to balance the chi, to get the energy meridians to flow. That is very much that Eastern philosophy, which, hasn't got any robust scientific evidence to say that that's actually what's happening. It's just a philosophy, it's an opinion. But the common belief is that originated from ancient China, but actually acupuncture as we know it today actually comes from uh, after the Chinese Revolution, Chairman Mao. Traditional Eastern acupuncture was a form of bloodletting. So samurai warriors used to use it after they've had injuries to help fight infections. They used to go and stick these needles into their wounds to drain blood, to remove infections from war wounds. So that's basically the origins of acupuncture. It then slowly evolved from that, but it hadn't been used in China for hundreds of years until Chairman Mao and the Chinese Revolution kicked in. And they were obviously trying to promote different philosophies from the West. And so they were trying to move away from Western medicine. And so Chairman Mao came up with reinvention of acupuncture as a way to cure all sorts of ailments. And the other reason I think it was also done was because their medical systems were just unable to keep up with helping people with benign medical problems like colds and diseases and joint aches and pains. So they said these are the treatments that you can do yourself. This is traditional acupuncture. And somehow it's just spread around the world as being this thing about balancing chi and energy and meridians and complete and utter unscientific sort of philosophies around. And then dry needling is the offshoot where the Westerners have said, okay, well, perhaps we don't need to use it around these, specific chi points, but we can go and stick these needles into people to release, points of tension. And these sometimes are referred to as muscle knots or trigger points. So when
Mm,
somebody has a tight muscle, this is thought to be due to a trigger point, a hypertonic area of this muscle that has stayed under constant contraction. So you need to stick a needle into this trigger point, into this muscle knot, and you get what's called, or you try to look for what's called the twitch reflex. So you see the muscle twitch underneath it. Aha, I've hit it. And you stab it repeatedly, and you try to break up this area of tension in the muscle, restore it back to its normal contractile ability, and then you've cured the trigger point. But again, the problem is there's no actual evidence that these muscle knots actually exist. These lumps that people feel haven't been seen to be any different than normal tissue. There's just variations in people's anatomy that I think we sometimes over pathologize a lot of the time. And again, I've been railing against trigger points for over a decade. And I just say people have sore spots in their soft tissues. I'm not doubting that at all. You can go around and press various different locations on people and on yourself, and you'll find areas that are just tender and sore. But that doesn't mean it's due to this theory of this isolated contraction or a muscle knot. They've never been seen. Muscle knots have never been proven to exist.
I like the note about pathologizing all these things because another line of questioning I had was we've got things like people talk about anterior pelvic tilt, scapular dyskinesis. Obviously, we hear muscular imbalances, trainers, Jesus Christ, muscular imbalances. So you've highlighted this shit as total bullshit. So do you want to elaborate on some of this stuff?
Yep. So again, this common misconception that everything has to be symmetrical and perfectly balanced is just not how the human body is designed and how it functions. We're all gloriously asymmetrical, and actually asymmetry is hugely beneficial for a lot of reasons for a lot of people. We live in a non-symmetry world. We do things with one hand more than the other. We prefer to use one leg for various different things than other legs. So asymmetry has been seen not to actually be a hindrance or dysfunctional. It can actually be beneficial, can actually be optimizations that we're looking at here, not dysfunctions. There's this belief that we know what perfect is, based on this sort of very robotic model of everything having to be balanced front to back, left to right, is just flawed hugely. Because as I say, human beings are just not built like that. So this whole theory about, pelvises need to be neutral, no evidence of that. In fact, we've got more evidence that the vast majority of us are in anterior pelvic tilt. So it seems like humans have evolved to be in more anterior pelvic tilt. And that can be beneficial, again, for various different reasons for various different people.
I remember doing a course years ago with my friend Dean Somerset, and Dean's going to appear on the podcast pretty close to yours. I'm not sure the order at this point, but he's done work on how hips, you can have two different shapes of hip socket, angle, ephemeral neck in the same person, and there's absolutely no dysfunction with that.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. So normal, morphological variations is another reason that we have no real idea about what is, normal because of the variations in the human population. So these bony landmarks that we often use around pelvises to gauge whether they are in neutral or are anterior posterior tilted are hugely variable. So we could be actually thinking that somebody is actually in anterior pelvic tilt just by judging where their anterior superior iliac spine is in relation to their posterior superior iliac spine. But because these bony prominences, these anterior and posterior spines could be variable by up to 20 to 30 degrees, it may mean that somebody's pelvis is in neutral, but it appears to be anteriorly tilted because of the variation in these bony landmarks. So we got all these sort of confounders to our ability to be able to say what is normal or what we thought was normal based on these things that we're now learning about, variations in skeletal morphology. And, hip sockets are another one. Thoracic gird, rib cages, shapes of our ribs is all variable, which then affects how the scapula sits and moves. So we got all these things to consider before we even start to think about deciding who is symmetrical or not.
What if someone is told that they have different leg lengths? Because I've had people who are really worried about that.
Yeah, again, it's another it's an easy explanation to give people to help them explain their pain, but it's completely false. It's a complete misrepresentation. And I think that's why a lot of these explanations are given to people, because they are easy for people and they're rational for people to sometimes
Mhm.
hang an idea upon. But the uncomfortable truth is it's not that simple. In fact, that's going to be one of my new slogans. It's not that simple, because when I hear these things and people say these things to me, I'll say, I really wish it was, because it would make our lives that easy. Because all we would need to do is just give you a little heel wedge, get your leg lengths balanced, and then all your symptoms should magically disappear. But they won't, because it's not that simple. Because symptoms are multifactorial, they're contributed by many things. But yeah, leg length differences are, again, one of the problems we have is accurately measuring them. I see clinicians using, tape measures that have gone from a DIY store. These things that they're inflexible and they're like metal, and they're holding them up against the patient, and they've got them roughly around somewhere on their hip, and then they go down to their foot and they go over to the other side and they say, yeah, I'm doing it roughly in the same sort of position as I was on the other side. Oh, look, it looks about a centimeter out. You've got a centimeter's leg difference. I'm like, well, how do you know you haven't just put it slightly different or superiorly or inferiorly by a centimeter by the time you've gone over to the other side? And you don't. And again, we've got these variations in these landmarks. Even if you were putting them accurately, you might find that there's just a natural difference in these landmarks that we're using. So our measurements aren't reliable anyway. And even when we do use reliable measurements, we see that about 90% of the population have a leg length difference on average around a centimeter and a centimeter and a half. So 10 to 15 millimeters of a leg length difference is a normal variation and something that most people have, and nothing to say, often contributing to anything significant to your symptoms. I think once you start getting above that, yeah, it might be a bit more higher up on the possibility list now of a contributing factor. But leg length differences don't occur overnight. Well, very rarely do they occur overnight. We're talking people that have had trauma, they've lost bone, or they've gone and had a hip replacement. These are things that will create a sudden
Mm.
overnight change in leg length difference. And in those situations, yeah, absolutely. Those things might be contributing to why you've got ongoing persistent problems afterwards.
You might have someone who's got a broken collarbone, and oftentimes the collarbones heal, whether naturally or reset. There could be a change to the length position of those, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lead to some sort of pain.
No, so there could be a period of adaptation needed for the body, and that's what we try to sell, promote to people, is that the human body is adaptable around these so-called dysfunctions anyway. It just often needs a period of time to be able to adapt to it. So if you do have a limb that has suddenly changed because of hip replacement, or you've had an open fracture and you've lost a centimeter of your tibia, it will adapt eventually to that. You will find that your body it's a biological environmental system. It will be able to work around these dysfunctions, no different than having a stroke in your brain. You get neuroplasticity. We have musculoskeletal plasticity. It just takes time for the body to adapt to it. So we just have to be patient. We have to work it out. And we have to try and promote that resilience and tolerance and adaptability by exposing you to doing things that will hopefully get things to learn to get used to the new positions and stuff.
There's a whole, and I guess I want to crystallize why all of this stuff matters. And I'll give a personal example. In certainly getting into your media the last couple of years, and a lot of the other smart physical therapists and strength coaches who talk about injury risk and the true nature of it, I have found that there were certain movement patterns. We'll say extension of my left shoulder could get painful, and I was always fearful of anterior humeral glide. But then I got to realize that, okay, these injuries aren't as serious as I first thought. And in seeing people like my friend Dr. Sam Spinelli's taking a look at a knee injury I've had. I've got a couple of great local physical therapists, Darren Bishop, Jason Dick, and Brendan DeForge. I got to shout you guys all out. You guys are amazing. I'd refer you guys to anybody because, and they value strength and conditioning, but they really helped me overcome some of the fear about movement. And so now I tend to like, I'll play with assisted dip machine, which puts me into that position with the shoulder. And I've learned, okay, a little bit of discomfort there is not necessarily a bad thing. I listen to my body, but I've actually learned to not fear, which is the big thing, and then tolerate that position. And I'm gaining some of the strength and control in those in that range back.
Perfect. That's exactly how, we should be promoting um, people to deal with these aches and pains. it's a bit of trial and error. It's a bit of experimentation. It's about finding, variations in doing things, modifying how you do things to see if you can, find that sweet spot. But there are no real rules here. That's what the thing that I think we need to move away from. This belief that everybody has to do an exercise or a movement in a set way. And I think that's where it all goes wrong. And we try to push people to do things in these ways where it could actually be making their symptoms worse. Asking people to maintain a neutral spine all the time when they're squatting, and this belief that it is better for them could actually be making people worse. It could actually be making their symptoms more uncomfortable, or, doing a dip with your hands perfectly symmetrical when you've got this natural slight asymmetry in one shoulder girdle to the other, where you might want to place one shoulder or one hand a little bit further forward or a little bit more internally rotated than the other one. Giving people the freedom and flexibility to explore movement variations, I think, is a key feature of good quality coaching, physiotherapy, and rehabilitation, and strength and conditioning training as well. I remember going back to my early days when I was taught, the 7 fundamental set up steps of a squat that everybody had to do. There were 7 steps that everybody had. Toes had to be in alignment, feet had to be facing dead forward, feet had to be shoulder width apart. You had to do it in a certain particular way so the knees wouldn't cross over too far over the toes. That had to be, coached and set up exactly the way for everybody. And I was getting people to squat that way who were just not comfortable squatting that way. No, it's all right. It's okay. This is the way you should be doing it. You've got to keep doing it. But I've learned now that's not the case. Some people like to have their toes splayed out. One person likes to have one foot going one way, the other one going the other way. Some people prefer to have their body in a slight more asymmetrical position. Some people like to have their knees further over the toes, behind their toes. And again, it's about just giving people, to say, that freedom and flexibility and reassurance it's okay to explore movement. I think that's where all the magic happens a lot of the time.
First thought. So if anybody's really interested in this stuff, did a much deeper dive on movement optimism, variable, unconventional movement. I'll have had Lucas Hardy on recently and Dr. Brandon Parker. And so there's actually a lot more stuff on this podcast there. So I want to actually go into something that you alluded to. Now, you talk a lot about the relationship between form and injury risk. And as a trainer, 14 years in the industry, obviously deeply indoctrinated for a long time that there's a very significant relationship between your form and your injury risk. And the evidence doesn't bear that out. Do you want to explain?
Yeah, so the common assumption is that by keeping things in alignment, you're going to reduce the risk of injury. But it's just not that simple again, because injuries are multifactorial, and often it's the exposures to loads that are often the key variable that often gets people injured. So they're often doing too much too quickly after doing too little for too long. And so their tissues are not able to keep up with the loads. And that's where injuries start to happen. Load exceeds tissue capacity. Now, playing around with various different, techniques of doing an exercise can change the loads into tissues, but it isn't always the way that you've been taught as being the most effective or safe way. So again, I think we just need to have that little step back from thinking that, we have to constantly ask people to do exercises with set techniques because it is deemed to be safer, when we don't really have much good evidence for that. But I will have a caveat here and say, that doesn't give us carte blanche to go crazy and start saying, okay, well, it doesn't matter. You can pick that weight up however you like, because I don't think that's the case either. And that's sometimes the straw man that I get quite a lot, is that when I have this little bit more relaxed approach to exercise technique, everybody says, oh, Adam Meakins says you can exercise however you want. You can do whatever you want. I'm like, no. There are times when doing an exercise with a certain specific technique can be very beneficial. The main ones I'm thinking about is just to get the stimulus into the muscle groups or the area that you want it to, without it being shared and redistributed to other areas to take away some of the stimulus that you want. So, if you want to get it,
which could lead to another tissue being exposed to more load that it can tolerate too, right?
exactly right. So again, it's about just saying sometimes, it's a case of what's the goal of this exercise? Do I want these Do I want the glutes to take the vast majority of the stimulus? Do I want this muscle group here to actually feel that's 90% of the work being done there? If so, technique is going to very much matter how I coach that exercise, because I want that muscle group to be doing the predominant amount of work. So I don't want other things compensating. But if I want somebody to move to stimulate multiple things at the same time, then I might say, okay, well, let's ask this to try and assist and help things out a bit. And if I'm starting to get people to start to work towards their maximal efforts and their, top markers of what they can do, then I think we're going to need the whole system to be able to contribute to performing that and executing that movement. Asking somebody to try and achieve their 1 RM, their 1 rep max on a deadlift by maintaining their spine in perfect neutral, I just don't think is possible, because they need that spine to allow to contribute to allow their other muscle groups to also help them lift that great big heavy weight up off the floor.
Which stands to reason that you want to, over time, progressively expose the spine to the ability. The spine is meant to bend and flex. This idea that it's supposed to be neutral, everything like what, 10, 12, 15 years ago, anti-rotation, every core exercise had to be anti-flexion, anti-rotation, any movement whatsoever was somehow bad. Go watch football. Like either your guys' version of it or ours, or hockey. Guess what? And watch people's spinal positions, especially as anything that's got contact, basketball, hockey, football, where there's going to be like unexpected forces coming at from all sorts of different angles. If this stuff was inherently injurious, all these players would be hurt all the time. Actually, I suppose this bridges something interesting. People also have a fear that lifting weights is unsafe. You want to talk about injury rates and strength training and maybe comparison to other sports?
Yeah, another common cultural misconception there about lifting heavy weights being dangerous and risky. But, again, the evidence just doesn't bear that out. So when we talk about injury risk, there's a number of ways of actually calculating how risky an injury is. There's various different methods that are used in the research, but the most common one is thousands of hours of exposure. So how many injuries do you get through 1,000 hours of exposure of that said exercise or sporting activity? And again, when you look at the exposure rates, the 1,000 hour exposure rates and amounts of injuries per 1,000 hours, resistance-based training, we're talking powerlifting, we're talking bodybuilding, we're talking Olympic lifting, has some of the lowest injury risks per 1,000 hours. So we're talking anywhere between, 1.5 to probably 4 injuries per 1,000 hours of exposure. Now, conversely, if we put that into running, recreational running, so this is people that, just want to run a 5K 3 times a week, for cardiovascular benefits. This is often seen as a very safe form of physical activity with very low risk of injury. But actually, depending on the experience of the runner, from either an inexperienced novice to a fairly high level runner, the injury rates here can be anywhere from 30 to up to 70 injuries per 1,000 hours of exposure. It's a massive difference. And to say running is often not seen as a high risk sport and activity. But when you look at the statistics, it says otherwise.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the running has sort of an inverted U where like beginners have higher rates, experienced recreational runners get lower again, but then when you get into competition marathon, it goes back up again. Am I right?
Yeah. So again, this is another great question that sort of isn't really fully answered, is what are we actually talking about here with an injury? Are we talking about something being broken and damaged, or are we
Yes.
talking about an episode of somebody having some pain and problems, which again is often a bit of an uncertain area. So some people will lump an injury as being an episode of pain that stops you from being able to exercise. Others will say, no, we need to have official diagnosis of pathology to class it as an injury. But when you look at running injuries, yes, you often see that, say, there is this U-shaped curve with exposure and experience, novices being the most high risk, recreational runners often being less riskier. But as you start to get into the more elite level type of running type of exposures, or ultra distance runners as well, again, we start to see that risk start to increase. Yeah,
And I think the increased risk comes with competition. And I think we see that across almost all sports.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
It's pretty much, fundamental. It's part of the game. If you're going to start going into competitions, you're going to start being competitive. Part of that recognition is that your injury risk goes up because you are now training harder. Your volumes are going to go up. Your frequency is going to go up. Other stresses are going to go up. The psychological stress as well, which is also a risk factor. These things are also going to increase your risk of having an injury. But I think most professional athletes know that, and most professional athletes are happy to take those risks because of the rewards that you get from it as well. So I think it's only physios and healthcare professionals that sometimes forget that people are prepared to take risks with injuries for the benefits and the rewards that it comes with. And this term that we use here about injury prevention, I know this is a bit of a contentious area. People say, it's a word that people will understand, but I think it's the wrong attitude, particularly with professional athletes, to say, we're going to prevent you from getting an injury. I think we need to be saying injuries are going to happen. What we need to do is prepare you for injuries. I think injury preparation is far more better psychologically and physiologically than saying we are working on injury prevention. Because when injuries happen, it just means, okay, all right, I was expecting it. It was going to happen. Right. How do I get back to where I was a minute ago? It just puts people, I think, in a much better psychological mindset, having that belief.
And it's not just the professional athletes or the rewards. I think with recreational athletes, like again, Canadian, I didn't really grow up with much hockey, but it's all around us. And I mean, anybody who's played much hockey, they don't have all their teeth and they don't seem too stressed out about it. This is like it's a hazard of the recreation, I suppose. And people seem to take it as it comes because they love the sport and they accept the possibility of some of these these occupational hazards, these things that another one in hockey players live in a constant state of groin injuries. It's just the positions that they're in all the time. And they don't seem to grumble too much about it because they just love going and playing hockey with their friends. And when it comes to people lifting, I have the same tact. I don't use the language injury prevention because I think it sets people up with an expectation. And then if something happens, because there's so many factors, we didn't have enough time to get into this, but load management, sure. Trainers, individuals lifting, we can control our progression and how we expose ourselves to challenge. But genetics are a major component in injury risk. Sleep and hydration we can generally control. But listen, we always have clients coming in, they're underslept. It's a good idea to ask them. Despite our best intentions, sometimes people can get hurt in the gym, even though I think the risks are quite low. I think the benefits are overwhelming. I try to get people who are fearful to understand all the potential benefits and to realize despite your best intentions, you can get hurt in the gym. It's usually not serious, but the alternative is to stay at home, bubble wrap on the couch, and allow the slow degradation of our muscles, bones, our mental health by not exposing ourselves to any sort of positive stress at all at any risk. And that's going to be a very painful existence magnified across time.
Yeah, fully with you there, Andrew. I think you say the benefits by a magnitude far outweigh, these risks when it comes to resistance-based training, whether you want to do powerlifting, bodybuilding, Olympic lifting, any form of resistance training, as I say, has benefits in an order of a magnitude compared to the
Mhm.
risks. And I say to people, if you think lifting heavy weights is risky, try being sedentary. Try living your life on the settee, on the couch, on the sofa, and you'll soon find out how risky that is. The problem is you won't get that immediate feedback of the risk, which is what the problem is with sedentary behavior. There is no immediate recognition of the risk. It's a slow build up of risk over time. It takes decades for you to notice it, but it's by far the more riskier pursuit, sedentaryism, than doing resistance-based exercises for sure.
If you were to say one final thing, because we obviously quote debunked and attacked a lot of sacred cows, and I'm probably going to get some angry messages about this one. That's fine. If you listening or hearing something, hopefully you took the nuance from it, and but there's something that you really like. Well, placebo and the power of belief, and if you have the financial resources and the time to invest in these things, most of these things probably don't have any demonstrable downside. To the person who is worried about deals with pain, etc., and is hearing all this stuff and is leaning on this stuff, quick summary of what you want them to focus on. What's the positive takeaway that they can?
So I think there's a number of things. I think the first thing is that the power of recovery is in yourself. I think, yes, healthcare providers and therapists are there to assist, support, guide, coach, mentor you through it. But at the end of the day, the power of your recovery is in your own hands. It's in your own mindset, belief, behaviors, and attitudes that help people feel better. So again, I often say, if you think you can get better, you will. If you don't, you won't. And again, it's just focusing on the big rocks, keeping it simple as a mantra of mine, at the end of the days, not letting the one percenters get in the way of things that have effects that can give you 90% benefits because you're focusing on something else that will give you a 1% benefit. That just makes absolutely no sense. So I think, it's about focusing on the bigger rocks. It's looking at, your lifestyle. It's looking at your activity levels. It's looking at your psychological statuses, your recovery strategies, your nutrition, and all these sort of things. These things to spend a bit of time and energy on. And we're not talking there have to be massive dramatic changes. You don't have to suddenly revamp your diet. You don't have to suddenly start doing, hundreds of hours of cardio a month or anything like those. But sometimes these small little changes into these big areas can have big effects. And it's not getting distracted by all this other nonsense that, often is expensive, time consuming, and not going to get you much bang for your buck.
Good. All right. I'm going to grab something here. Come here, Oz. My cat came up here. Now, I keep hearing this thing on social media. I don't know if there's any evidence, but apparently just cats have healing powers. Cats' furs have healing powers. And I'm guessing it's probably, upregulating parasympathetic nervous system tone and just like compassionate touch and just this sweet, fluffy thing. Anyway, so he's not having it. He doesn't like being on camera. He's trying to fight his way
He
out.
was hiding
So
in the background. Yeah.
yeah, well, he just came up and but anyway, the Spotify watchers can see my cat Ozzy, so he's kind of well known on my social media. Now, as to your social media, people can follow you at Adam Meakins. You're one of those rare people that gets your own name without having to add any numbers or other sort of bullshit like the word fitness in it, like
Yeah, I
I
haven't
have.
come across many other Adam Meakins in the world. And that's probably fortunate for them, I'd say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who share my name in the grand scheme of things. I go on Twitter and I've had to mute a lot of them because some of them talk about politics, and I'm like, sweet fucking Christ. So what other resources? I mean, I can't stress enough. Everybody, please go follow Adam. Your stuff is really entertaining. It's very informative, evidence-based, and especially if you felt like any of your sacred cows were, quote, attacked or questioned here, go do the deep dive, explore it a little bit more, okay? Like challenge those beliefs as opposed to saying, nope, this is bad. I'm going to live in the echo chamber of my existing belief system. What else do you got for people?
So yeah, my social media is Adam Meakins. I've got a website, adammeakins.com as well, where I've got, access to blogs and stuff along those lines that I've done over the last 10 years or so. And I do a couple of online courses if anybody's interested in learning a bit more about painful shoulders. I specialize in the upper limb and the painful shoulder. I've got a new online sort of course where I go through the essentials of rehab, which is focusing on communication skills, behavior change, motivational interviewing, and stuff like that, which I think is essential to be a good rehab specialist. It's the power of communication is an undervalued skill. We always focus on exercise prescription, which is important, I know. But again, being able to convince people and communicate with people, I think, is the first thing we want to be trying to do. So there's a little online course there with some top tips for rehab professionals there. And yeah, I think that's about it.
Well, again, like I've continuously said, I've enjoyed your media. I've learned a lot from it. It's influenced things I've done. If anybody's
Thanks, mate.
interested in more in a resource on injury risk, what creates injury risk, I wrote an article recently for Elite FTS, and it's influenced by Adam's media. So message me, I'll send it to you. I'd love for you guys to read it. It's an attempt to get into the hands of both fitness professionals, but everyday people, something really accessible that'll alleviate a lot of your fears, highlight what's within our control, but also just contextualize the stuff that we can't control. So that way we're good about the fact, all right, if an injury happens, it's not the end of the world. And for everybody listening, again, I've had some recent episodes with people like Dr. Brandon Parker that should expand upon the stuff we're talking about here. I'll have Dean Somerset on very adjacent to this episode. He's another great professional in this space. I have Dr. Sam Spinelli planned soon, but there's also a lot of other stuff. I've got Mike Israel recently talking about AI and how it's going to improve your quality of life around fitness. So I'm going to work hard to continue to bring you amazing guests. I'm very lucky to have access to people like Adam. I appreciate your time. And, for anybody who is just finding this through Adam's media. Again, check out some of the other episodes I've had recently, and I would love to have you stick around. Adam, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Andrew, and say keep on doing what you're doing, mate. And anybody listening, I would stress going to follow Andrew's stuff as well, because he does put out some good info on there. So keep on doing what you're doing, mate. Top marks to you.
Thank you.